Good afternoon. I'm Paul Brest, and Deborah Satz and I welcome you to the third class session of Democracy and Disagreement. Each of our 10 classes addresses a contemporary issue of policy about which people may hold strong differing views. And each class has two goals. First, to illuminate these issues, and second, to do so by modeling the critical, empirically informed, respectful conversations that lie at the core of the university's mission, the pursuit of knowledge. We recognize that engaging in respectful discourse is only one mode of bringing one's case to one's fellows. Protest and organizing are also legitimate modes of engagement, although subject to time and place restrictions. For anyone who feels motivated to protest, there's a free speech zone outside of the auditorium for doing so, but inside our classroom, students and visitors will have the chance to ask questions and make comments. We provide as much room as possible for your participation. Before I introduce today's topic, if you're a student enrolled in the course, I think we'll put up the QR code and in front of our guest, Robert Post, and so you can scan the QR code. Are we putting up the QR code? There, so scan that so we have your attendance if you're a student in the class. So our focus today is the question of when university presidents and other officials or official bodies may appropriately speak on matters of public policy or social impact. There's little doubt that university officials may, indeed must, take positions on matters that directly affect the institution. For example, whether and how to seek diversity among its faculty and students, and the scope of non-discrimination policies. But questions arise about taking positions on social issues and public policies beyond the institution, or on matters of science. I'm going to give you two examples from Stanford's own history. In 1971, Stanford's Faculty Senate passed a resolution calling for the government to take immediate steps to involve U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Laos. 3 years later, in response to that resolution and to other concerns about academic freedom, the university adopted this very short statement on academic freedom. I'm going to read you the two sentences. Stanford University's central functions of teaching, learning, research, and scholarship depend upon an atmosphere in which freedom of inquiry, thought, expression, publication, and peaceful assembly are given the fullest protection. Expression of the widest range of viewpoints should be encouraged, free from institutional orthodoxy and from internal or external coercion. We're going to come back to the concept of institutional orthodoxy in different forms throughout today's class. The prohibition of institutional orthodoxy was intended to prohibit resolutions of the sort that the Faculty Senate passed in 1971, the resolutions condemning U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Those who drafted the 1974 Statement on Academic Freedom, including me, learned from the University of Chicago's Principles of Institutional Neutrality contained in the Calvin Report several years earlier. Issues involving institutional orthodoxy or neutrality or restraint, and we'll talk some about the differences among those concepts. Those issues have continued to arise in subsequent years, most recently around university presidents' statements or refusal to make statements about racial violence, abortion policies, and issues involving Israel and Palestine. In 2020, back to Stanford, in 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, the Faculty Senate passed a resolution condemning certain actions of Hoover Senior Fellow and Presidential Advisor Scott Atlas. Among the actions cited were discouraging the use of masks and other protective measures, misrepresenting knowledge and opinion regarding the management of pandemics, endangering citizens and public officials, showing disdain for established medical knowledge, and damaging Stanford's reputation and academic standing. The resolution stated that Atlas's behavior is, quote, anathema to our community, our values, and our beliefs that we should use knowledge for good. The Senate is currently, by which I mean last week, considering a resolution to rescind that resolution on two grounds. First, that Scott Atlas was not invited to appear and defend himself, a concern about due process. And secondly, and more relevant to today's discussion, that the Senate's taking a position on the science of appropriate pandemic measures violated the prohibition of institutional orthodoxy contained in the 1974 Statement on Academic Freedom. The issue is not Scott Atlas's academic freedom in particular, but rather the academic freedom of all researchers to come to their own conclusions and argue about them free from inhibition by the university. Even when passing the 1971 resolution urging the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, the Faculty Senate recognized the importance of avoiding institutional orthodoxy. It drew a distinction between making statements on political issues in general, which were prohibited, and making statements on issues that, to quote the resolution, have devastating repercussions on the university itself. In last week's Faculty Senate debates about rescinding the censure of Scott Atlas, one faculty member argued that his position on matters of public health had devastating consequences for the university. Our participants today will discuss these principles in depth and consider their application to a variety of issues, including whether they agree that the war in Vietnam or Dr. Atlas's comments affected Stanford so directly as to justify the Faculty Senate's actions. Leading off the discussion will be my law school colleague, Professor Diego Zambrano. Diego's primary research and teaching interests lie in areas of civil procedure, transnational litigation, and judicial federalism. His work explores the judicial litigation landscape, institutions, norms, and incentives that influence litigant and judicial behavior. He's the Associate Dean for Global Programs and Faculty Director of the Newcomb Center for the Rule of Law. He's also a member of the Faculty Senate's Ad Hoc Committee on University Speech, which will be reporting to the Senate this spring. Next is my colleague from the Graduate School of Education, Professor Emily Levine, a prominent historian of higher education who also has a courtesy appointment in the Department of History. Among her recent books is Allies and Rivals, German-American Exchange and the Rise of the Modern Research University, published by the University of Chicago Press. Emily and I recently co-organized a conference on restoring inclusive critical discourse to the university, and together with Diego, she's a member of the Faculty Senate's Ad Hoc Committee on University Speech. And we're fortunate, can we put Robert Post back up on the screen? We are fortunate to be joined on Zoom by Professor Robert Post from Yale Law School, who served as the school's dean from 2009 until 2017. Professor Post specializes in constitutional law with a particular emphasis on the First Amendment. Like Professor Levine, he's a historian with a major book on the Taft Court. He's also co-author of a book called For the Common Good, Principles of Academic Freedom, which has become the standard reference for the meaning of academic freedom in the United States. We imagine that the speakers will converse for about 50 minutes, with Deborah Satz moderating the conversation. Then the floor will be open for questions and comments from the audience. And we want to survey you, participants in the class, at the beginning and end of the class to see whether arguments moved minds. That said, even if your positions don't change, we hope that the discussion that follows will give you an appreciation for the reasoning behind the views you hold or reject. And we now turn to the poll, which we'll ask at the beginning and then at the end of class. And the question is, should university presidents issue statements about important matters of social concern or public policy? And with that, I turn the podium over to our first speaker, Diego Zambrano. So Diego, before you go, see the poll. Close to evenly divided.
Do you want me to give him some time for the poll? Or are we good? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dean Brest, Dean Satz. It's great to be here, and thanks to my co-panelists. I'm happy to have this discussion on an important topic to universities today. So let me first repeat what Dean Brest said and define my understanding of the issue. We're focusing specifically on statements made by university leaders about events that are external to the university, foreign policy events, even domestic political questions. We are not covering statements that university leaders may want to make about something happening inside the university. I think we would all agree that university leaders can make statements about our own values, whether it is academic freedom, commitment to truth-seeking, or our response to something that happened on campus. There's then a tricky area of statements about external events that may or may not affect our campus, and probably our discussion is going to be about that. But let me focus on statements that are external. So my approach to think about this is the way we should evaluate any policy question. We should first figure out what the benefits are of such a policy. Then we should think about and quantify the costs. And then we should weigh those two. That's how we should decide questions in general. And I think often we talk about institutional neutrality in a very abstract way. But once we try to think carefully about the benefits and costs, I think the answer is much clearer. So let me start with the benefits. How exactly does it help? Who does it help when a university issues a statement on an external event? I almost never hear supporters of institutional position-taking defend with evidence any benefits. But let me try to offer a few. So first, students demand that universities take positions. So perhaps the benefit is some vague notion that students will be emotionally satisfied by position taking. As an initial matter, we should be very clear. Satisfying student demand is not the university's job. The university's job is to create an atmosphere conducive to the production of knowledge and to educate students. None of that entails satisfying student demands. But even if we acknowledge that this should be a consideration, it seems like a really weak benefit because there's almost always disagreement among the students. So when the university takes a position, it's going to satisfy some students. It's also going to upset other students. The ones that disagree will be emotionally dissatisfied. Moreover, this benefit seems fleeting. Even if you grant that some students will be satisfied by a particular statement, they're highly likely to be satisfied in the long run. Why do I say that? Because students may agree when you take a popular position on, say, the Supreme Court's decision on abortion, but they're going to disagree when you take a position that's not popular among the students on, say, foreign affairs. So I think in the aggregate, in the long run, we have no reason to expect consistent student satisfaction with position taking. And if we did arrive at that for some reason, well, then the university would be an ideological institution. And I don't think anyone benefits from that. So on the whole, statements are likely to upset students as they are to satisfy the students. Okay, a second possible benefit is that students can change the outcome of a political issue. Not students, universities can change the outcome. I don't think anyone is as presumptuous as to claim this. I see no empirical evidence that universities can change the outcome of a particular issue. I don't think we can come up with a single example of universities changing the outcome of external events. Even most proponents admit that it would be at most symbolic. Well, again, it is not the university's job to engage in symbolic statements. All right, third, perhaps there is a teaching purpose to position taking. Again, this seems very weak to me because as far as I'm aware, nobody considers it good pedagogy to send out an email with a poorly reasoned position as a way to teach students about something. This is simply not how we teach students. This is not how I teach students in my class. This is not how we learn that pedagogy is effective. So at the end of my presentation, I'll give some ideas of how you actually do teach students. But I think there's no reason to think that this teaches them. So those are three very, very weak benefits. I think we're left with almost nothing on the benefit side. So let's move on to the cost side. First, as you know, one of the major arguments against institutional position taking is that there's a serious danger that it can chill faculty and student speech. When school administrations speak authoritatively about contested questions, they discourage individual inquiry into those questions. That's especially dangerous when deans and department heads take positions because they make decisions on the tenure of junior faculty. And that affects how junior faculty behaves. I think in many different areas of life, we accept as obvious that when an authority figure takes a position, that's going to affect what the juniors in any, it could be any job, will behave. So we're seriously concerned that this will affect student and academic faculty speech. We have a lot of surveys showing that students are self-censoring. We know that there's something here. We can talk about whether this is empirically supported or not in a moment. Okay, second, another cost. Position taking can hurt the legitimacy of the university in the eyes of the public. Look at the surveys. University legitimacy has taken a huge toll in the past decade. Surveys find a decline in trust in higher education from 57% 10 years ago to 36%. Just an absolute collapse. It coincides with universities increasingly taking positions. I would postulate that these things are related. When outsiders perceive that the university is biased, they stop trusting everything we do. They stop trusting anything any of our schools do, the medical school, the law school, engineering. They don't think universities are trustworthy when they engage in political statements. Third, position taking generates endless demands for more position taking. It leads to a morass. Once you take a side, it invites complaints about why or when the university takes sides and when it doesn't. It generates a never-ending set of demands that imposes a huge cost on administrators and university leaders who are constantly flooded with demands. Even worse, students are almost never satisfied with the content of these statements. So it's a morass. It leads to endless demands that imposes costs on everyone. Relatedly, taking positions leads to inevitable inconsistency. We have to ignore some events, even though we speak about other events. And that's a problem. There are at any point in time a dozen events around the world that are worthy of saying something about. For instance, I'm from Venezuela. We had 5 million people who emigrated to Venezuela since 2019. One of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in the Western Hemisphere. As far as I'm aware, no university has ever said anything about it. So it is a problem when we say some things about some events and not others. Fourth, when universities take a position, they engage in a deeply anti-academic affair because they do so in overly simplistic terms, generally emails, that oversimplify issues. The university's research mission relies on expertise. But when a university leader takes a position, they are almost never experts in that particular area. So we trade complexity, which is what we should be dealing with in a university, for simplicity. That hurts the university's research mission. Now, sometimes you have academics here studying an issue for decades. And then a dean comes out with an email settling the question. It's deeply anti-intellectual to do that. Fifth, university leaders are not chosen because of their moral compass. They are chosen because they're good administrators. So if you want them to take positions, if that's what we're going to settle on, you're going to need to change how we select them. And it's going to make it much more difficult to select leaders because we won't agree on what it means to have a good moral compass. Six, when universities take positions, they insert themselves into the political process and therefore invite external intervention. Ideological actors in state governments are eager to attack universities. You know all the examples, Texas, Florida, etc. We make it easy for them when we get involved in political questions. We invite and give them ammunition for their attacks on universities. Okay, so when you step back, I see 3 really weak benefits, 6 pretty serious and strong costs. So I see the conclusion as inevitable. A university should not take positions on external political questions. And yes, we should have a rule that prohibits them from doing so. Now, we could talk about the gray zone when an external event affects the mission of the university, but I think if we move from a situation where the status quo is taking a position 20 times a year to taking a position once or twice a year, we still have all the costs that I mentioned, but we'll be in much better territory, and we can have that conversation. Moreover, when the university is silent, it creates space for the people who should actually take positions, the faculty, the experts on these questions, and the students. So instead of issuing these authoritative pronouncements that mollify no one, schools should focus on providing an environment in which students and faculty can engage in a genuine conversation. And I think I won't have that much more time, but during the conversation, I'll be able to address the empirical critique, that we don't have empirical evidence that this chills speech. So I'll talk a bit more about that during the Q&A. I'll also talk about whether it's avoidable, whether it's even possible for the university to take no sides. I'm happy to talk about that question. I'll just finish here by saying the educational mission of the university can be served in all of the different ways that we know how to teach students. We teach them through the curriculum we have. We teach them through our faculty hiring faculty who are good teachers, who expose them to intellectual diversity and different positions. We teach them by supporting faculty in their research. We teach them by planning lecture series like this. We teach them in how we structure orientation. That is how you teach. We know this, and that's what we should focus on, not these emails that are simplistic and against the mission of the university. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I echo Professor Zambrano's thanks to the deans for the invitation, and I'm laughing because going after Professor Zambrano makes me write furiously, and I feel like I have to change all of my comments. But instead, I will thank him, my interlocutor, and thank Professor Post, from whom I've already learned so much. And in fact, my brief comments will obscure just how much engaging with their work, with which I don't entirely agree, has helped me refine my views on the question put to you all this afternoon. Should university presidents issue statements about important matters of social concern or public policy? And in the interest of identifying areas of reasonable disagreement, my answer is yes. Qualified by insofar as those statements and those matters directly impact the mission of the university. Now, I'm not so sure as Paul that we agree on what that is, or with Diego that we can easily divide what is internal and what is external. In my opening remarks, I want to make one big overarching point, and then I'll have 3 takeaway points that follow. So first, the headline is I will show how my understanding of history, specifically the history of the university as an ideal, the history of universities in their specificity as institutions, and perhaps most important for our conversation, the history of the concept of institutional neutrality informs my position. And then I'm going to have 3 takeaway points from this overarching point. And in the interest of not burying the lead in what is a kind of sort of complex set of issues, I'll just name them outright. So the first is my point is that our current understanding of institutional neutrality obscures the paradoxical nature of the university as both an institution of scholarship that's separate and apart from society, and an institution that's deeply intertwined with that same society. And any principle of institutional, I'll call it standpoint, must reconcile these opposing truths. Two, I'll argue that we've erroneously conflated institutional neutrality with the university's educational imperative. And these are not the same. And in fact, external institutional neutrality, even if it were possible, and I don't think that it is, necessitates active internal support of the university's educational purpose. And then three, universities are not neutral. They are purposeful institutions oriented towards truth-seeking and their adjacent values. This is what distinguishes them from other discursive fora, so spaces where speech happens, including the town square, that free speech zone, or on social media. Okay, so to step back. So first, a bit about me. I'm an intellectual historian of higher education, as Dean Brest mentioned. I historicize concepts that we take for granted. So the first thing that I do when there's a disagreement about a term is I understand the context in which it first arose, was constructed, and how it was received. And institutional neutrality is an invention of a particular historical moment. In this case, a concept that projects a view of the relationship between the university and society that was crafted in direct response to intense student protest in the 1960s. So at the end of January 1967, President of the University of Chicago, George Beadle, asked Harry Calvin, a professor of First Amendment law, to chair a committee charged with producing, quote, a statement on the university's role in political and social action. The committee consisted of 7 scholars from different disciplines and perspectives, and I'll just highlight 3 for the purposes of our conversation. One was Jacob Getzels, an educational psychologist and Polish-born Jew. One was George Stigler, a classical liberal and economist of the Chicago School. And another was Gilbert White, a geologist and Quaker who had been interned by the Nazis in World War II and was a conscientious objector. And together, along with a number of other scholars, they produced the so-called Calvin Report, and that's the report you read for today, or at least was assigned on your syllabus for today. So I've read the correspondence among these men, and they were all men, the minutes of their meetings and their early draft. And my view is that this archive presents a more nuanced portrait of the relationship between the university and society than the one that we've inherited. Today's advocates of institutional neutrality tend to cite a now famous line from the Calvin Report, quote, "The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic." And actually that appears in the petition to rescind the censure of Scott Atlas that Dean Brest mentioned. But what that statement, however powerful and true, obscures is that the document, the Calvin Report, also begins and ends with a discussion of the university's undeniable role in social and political affairs, including 2 powerful exceptions that constitute circumstances under which the university is justified to intervene. Now, this would not have been far-fetched for the members of the committee who convened at the end of a decade in which President Beadle and his predecessor had actively engaged in lobbying and restructuring the urban environment around the U of C campus. And whether or not you see their projects as urban renewal or racist real estate policies, one fact is undeniable. It was not neutral. The students who served Provost Edward Levy with an advanced warning of their protest in fall 1966 had a number of grievances stemming from the civil rights movement and changes to the draft. But specifically, they wanted the university to divest its money from banks that were invested in apartheid South Africa. Getzel wrote a letter to Calvin behind the scenes, quote, "The present position of unqualified political and social neutrality is simple, traditional, easy to administer, and safe. Yet the very existence of this committee and the writing of this document suggests that there are some nagging doubts," end quote. Some of those doubts were assuaged over the course of the 6 months when the committee met. Others were not. An unresolvable disagreement emerged between Stigler and White that stemmed from the question, how should the university engage in its corporate capacity. White wanted to call out the opposition that might arise between paramount social values and the university's role as a landlord, while Stigler favored a more absolutist approach. In fact, the strongest language on the position of neutrality in the final version that you read comes from Stigler. Phrases also that didn't make it into the document, like when the university enters into social and political movements, it becomes an instrument of oppression against the individual professor. And I think that even just knowing that illustrates the spectrum of disagreement that the final document has to synthesize. The disagreement between Stigler and White was so irreconcilable that Calvin wrote to Beadle, quote, "My feeling is that it would be more useful and helpful to invite them to append a brief statement of their views on the point rather than attempt to hammer it out, language covering it." And that's why you see actually a dissent appear at the bottom of the statement, which, while common in the law, I would venture to say is not terribly common in the genre of university committee reports. There's also, in the 5th paragraph from the bottom, for those of you who want to follow along, an extraordinary exception to the principle that reads, quote, "From time to time, instances will arise in which the society or segments of it threaten the very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry. In such a crisis, it becomes the obligation of the university as an institution to oppose such measures and actively to defend its interests and its values," end quote. Now, this exception clause, too, stems from a moment of exchange behind the scenes, a document that Getzel circulated in March of 1967 titled "The University and Political Action." And in it, he urged Calvin to consider, and I quote at length, "If we assume that the function of the university is to conserve, create, and communicate knowledge without restriction, the proposition that the university be preempted a priori from taking a position because the issue originates in political or social action may ultimately be as dangerous to the university as what it stands for as the counterproposition." End quote. And then Getzel then rehearsed Pastor Niemöller's 1946 poem, which was titled "First They Came For." And for those of you who don't know, Niemöller was a German theologian who became known for his opposition to the Nazi regime. And Getzel substitutes the university for the individual here in this letter to Calvin to underscore his point. He writes, quote, "In Germany in the 1930s, they first came for the communists, and the university didn't speak up because it wasn't communist. Then they came for the Jews, and the university didn't speak up because it wasn't Jewish. Then they came for the trade unionists, and the university didn't speak up because it wasn't a trade union. Then they came for the church, and the university didn't speak up because it wasn't a church. Then they came for the university, and by that time, no one was left to speak up. Is the university as a corporate entity less responsible than Pastor Niemöller as an individual? From today's perspectives, had it been the University of Chicago, should it have persisted in an unqualified political and social neutrality? Is there no political or social issue on which the university should speak up? None at all," Getzel asked. And then he goes on to talk about if the university were under pressure to publish certain books of economic theory. Wouldn't Stigler want the university to speak up then for the value of free inquiry? Okay, maybe. What if it's the public library, though, adjacent to the university, and it were under a similar ban? Would the university speak up for this other institution, also in the name of free inquiry? The archive demonstrates that Calvin never intended for the report to be orthodoxy. I believe that citizens of the university inherit a conversation as much as a tradition, a position that evidently Calvin shared as he explained to Beadle that the reason for including the dissent and the exceptions was precisely to try to preserve the nuance in that disagreement. The AAUP document from 1970 that you also read for this week goes further, and rather than hide the disagreement among the ranks, as Professor Post points out in a recent essay, it publishes two opposing positions side by side that capture this dialogical quality of the university. Now, why is this all important? Here are my three final takeaways that follow this foray into the historical archive. One, the Getzel-inspired exception clause, sometimes I call this the Nazi clause, in the Calvin report suggests that the university should make statements on social and political affairs if those statements directly impact the mission of the university. This position is more faithful to the university's history and identity, namely as both a house of critics and as what Professor Mitchell-Stevens and I call in our Stanford and its Worlds class, a civic actor. And often we hear arguments from promoters and critics that are equally strident in invoking one or the other, but in fact, both opposing truths are correct, and any principle adopted must deal with this paradox. Two, the current orthodox interpretation of institutional neutrality has erroneously, and I think unhelpfully, conflated an institution's intervention in external affairs with its mostly, albeit not entirely, internal obligation towards its educational mission. Universities have both a scholarly imperative to advance knowledge to the best of their ability with evidentiary criteria and boundaries of argumentation. They are also beholden to an educational imperative to articulate the values that form the basis of a shared epistemic, by which I mean knowledge-seeking foundation. Statements on external political and social events are distinct from moderating, mediating, and intervening in speech with this respect on campus. Three, my final takeaway is that universities are not neutral entities. They are institutions oriented towards the purpose of truth-seeking. To put this in terms of an analogous debate that's happening in the tech world, is the university a platform for speech, or does it itself have purposeful speech? And for me, the answer is clearly the latter, or else there's no difference between Stanford and YouTube. Truth-seeking has adjacent values. We cannot pursue truth-seeking without free expression, and we cannot pursue truth-seeking without the inclusion of all viewpoints and individuals as honored knowers in the community of discourse. To be sure, values can be mapped onto politics, but that is not adequate reason for not identifying them, articulating them, and defending them. In conclusion, not only should university presidents be authorized to issue statements that support the university's mission as a truth-seeking institution, which means supporting both free expression and belonging, all of us who live and work in these institutions should be compelled, obligated, responsible to speak up on behalf of these values. To be sure, some are willing to curtail more freedom to increase the sense of inclusions, and others are willing to withstand more discomfort for the sake of freedom. But that is a conversation about value trade-offs, one that we should have, and I'm sure that we will.
Over to you, Robert.
Robert, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you both for those wonderful presentations. It calls to mind an old story about a rabbi and a shtetl in Poland, and there are two parties that come to him with a dispute, and the first party says this and that and the other was terrible, and the rabbi says, "Oh, I agree with you," and then the other party comes and they say, "Yeah, but this, and this," and the rabbi says, "Yeah, I agree with you." And then the first party says, "Wait a minute, you just agreed with me." And the rabbi says, "I agree with you both." That's the sense I have of this debate. I myself come someplace in the middle between Emily and Diego in their fine presentations. So the first question I think we ought to put on the table is, how did this become an issue for us, institutional neutrality? So the Calvin Report is 1967. And it's in response to a demand by SDS that Chicago divest in South Africa. And of course, it was extremely convenient for the administration of Chicago to be able to announce a general principle, academic freedom or institutional neutrality, to prevent such raids on its endowment. And the Calvin Report complied. The Calvin Report at the time was not received as truth. In fact, it sparked a vigorous debate at the American Association of University Professors. It was viewed as quite problematic, and there were professors on all sides of this issue, but no major university other than the University of Chicago adopted a policy of institutional neutrality. Just didn't until North Carolina about 2 years ago. And the reason North Carolina adopted that policy is because there was a report by something called the Goldwater Institute And it was part, I would say, of what has become a general assault on universities by certain political parties. There is now, you might have noticed in the United States, deep polarization. And this corresponds to a form of populism that is anti-expertise. And that anti-expertise has marked the university as the enemy of real Americans. So if you look, for example, at President Trump's 1776 report, which is a potted history of the United States, I don't remember, 40, 50 pages, at least 3 of them are dedicated to showing that the university is the enemy of the people, that it spawns untruths and makes people unpatriotic, etc. So universities have become the target. And one way to make the universities the target is we talk about universities being neutral institutions, but I don't know even what it means to talk about an institution being neutral. If it's really neutral in all things, if it has no purposes, then it is a neutered institution. And I think this notion of institutional neutrality was revived by the Goldwater Institute precisely to neuter the ability of universities to speak out on public issues. And the argument which they made was that if the university takes a position on a matter of public controversy, it will impair the academic freedom of faculty and of students. So if the university takes a position as a matter of principle, and this is, I think, an argument stronger than that which Diego put on the table. Diego put it as a cost-benefit analysis. It could do something and it could do something else. But the argument that one sees in the media now, and often when this matter is debated, is that as a matter of principle, if the university takes a position on a matter of social policy that's controversial, it mechanically truncates the academic freedom of the members of the university. I think that proposition is patently false. And you can see that it's patently false from the fact that in the years after the Calvin Report, literally hundreds of universities divested from South Africa. And there isn't any reported instance of anybody's research being compromised, any complaints of academic freedom being minimized or decreased as a result. I think it's like implausible to say that the divestment of a university's endowment from an institution will have an effect on the research agenda of its faculty, the freedom to teach of its faculty, or the freedom to learn of its students. I think everything we have from experience shows the opposite. On the other hand, it can be the case that when a university takes a position, it can do it in a way that compromises the academic freedom of members of the university. And if that is the case, then the university shouldn't act that way. If the University of Stanford's faculty wants to condemn the research and statements of a faculty member, that is the meaning of compromising academic freedom, because it's saying you cannot speak in that way. That is very different than the university taking a position and it having an impact on a faculty member. Whether it does or it doesn't, contingent matter. Now, Diego was very interesting, gave an argument of costs and benefits, and then announced, well, we have to have a rule for all times, all places, all circumstances. I don't understand why we need a rule. It seems to me that universities ought to be very careful to weigh the costs and the benefits of the kind that Diego analyzed and decide whether any given statement is worthwhile or not. And the payoff matrix can be very different depending on all varieties of circumstances, including the Nazi circumstance that Emily put on the table. That is, universities are institutions that require a certain kind of culture to thrive. They require certain forms of tolerance in order for them to do their jobs. And in speaking in support of that tolerance, you might say they're speaking in support of their mission, but they're not literally speaking in support of their mission. And you could interpret that to be speaking about matters of public controversy, as undoubtedly it will, if you're in a situation where the culture necessary to a university is under threat. So universities need to think very hard about that. But the way I would conceptualize it isn't the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 harms and 1, 2, 3 benefits. I think every situation will come with a very complex set of trade-offs. Very complex and contextual judgment will be required. And we need university administrators who can do that, because any leader of any institution needs to be able to do that. It may be true, as Diego says, that we don't ordinarily pick university administrators because they're statesmen, but no one can lead an institution of the size of Stanford or of the size of Yale unless they are statesmen, because none of this is mechanical. And none of this is a matter of algorithm. All of it is a matter of judgment. And the political judgment, as well as the managerial judgment, is required to lead a university. It is the case that when a university leader, and here we're not just talking about administrators, we're talking about anybody speaking on behalf of the university, which can be faculty in the form of a departmental resolution, et cetera. So I think the general category here is those speaking on behalf of the university, as distinguished from, say, a faculty member speaking on their own behalf. If a university, or if anyone at the university is speaking on behalf of the university, they have to understand that universities are quite vulnerable. Universities are systems of self-regulation at this point. We have autonomy from the general society. The academic freedom we enjoy is really quite special. Most professions seek professional self-regulations. Lawyers seek it, but they lost it. Doctors sought it and they lost it. The clergy sought it and they largely lost it. Universities still have it. We are remarkable that way, that we're, on the whole, we have seen now threats in Florida and Texas, which are quite unprecedented, but on the whole, we are institutions that manage to declare and deserve and receive a form of independence. When universities administrators leave their lane, when people on behalf of the university leave their lane and speak about matters other than their mission of research or teaching, then they make the university vulnerable to reprisals for many of the reasons that Diego said. So if you're going to do that, if you're a university administrator, you have to be extremely thoughtful about it. So the position that I take is really one that is consonant with that articulated by the president of Princeton, Christopher Eisgruber, who says we have here not a policy of institutional neutrality, which is mechanical, but a policy of institutional restraint, which rests on counsels of prudence and judgment. And that is what we pursue at Princeton. I think that's a good way to think about it myself.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open up for some discussion on the stage, and I thought I would I'll give you a short surprise and then a not surprising question. The short surprise is, as a philosopher, I'm going to point out a history piece, which is I don't think the idea of institutional neutrality or taking positions originates with Calvin. I think if you go back to some of the Plato's Academy, you will see a view that the mission of education is not to think for students or to tell them what to think or to pronounce, but to create an environment that's maximally free for the students to figure out for themselves. And I actually think in Chicago, even before the Calvin Report, you see echoes of that Greek ideal. So that's the history point. But now, not surprisingly, as a philosopher, I'm going to push back a little on the case by case and talk about principles, which I don't think have to be rigid in their application, because I agree that the application of principles requires judgment. And what I wanted to get us to think about in principles is, so there's a way of articulating it, and Diego did some of this, and so did Emily, and actually, Robert, you also referenced it, where internal matters that pertain to the institution's mission of research and teaching are absolutely issues the university needs to take a stand on. Right, so we're not neutral about truth, we're not neutral about cheating, we're not neutral about plagiarism, and we're not neutral about the silencing of voices on campus, because we believe that an inclusive environment of respect is conducive to the production of knowledge. Now, internal, though, doesn't just mean on campus. It can involve external actions. So when the government takes a stand, let's say on research regulation or faculty doing research in China involving Chinese partners, it's actually critical that the university, to protect its mission, not fail to speak up on things that endanger the research mission of the university. Now, so internal and external can't mean like here on campus versus not on campus. And I do think there are going to be some tricky issues then about when are things in Washington or in the public culture such that they wind up impinging on the actual ability of the university to do its research and teaching mission. But that's still the principle. And where it doesn't impinge on that, I actually think it's a mistake for the reasons that Diego articulated and some of the reasons that Robert, you just articulated. I think it's very dangerous for the university to put itself in the business, both because it makes itself a target, but also it settles questions that we want to keep open. And the point of being here to learn is to keep questions open. I sometimes think, and I'll stop with this, you know, when I was a student activist, I could not have cared less what the university's position was on different issues, right? I wasn't looking for the university to issue a position that backed up my view. I didn't really care what they thought. I wanted to articulate my view and organize around my view and try to motivate and convince other people and change society. And I think the looking to university leaders to settle questions is pretty problematic of something that's gone wrong in kind of the culture that we're in. So anyway, I'm just interested in your reactions to the internal, external, how to think about that, and whether the principle of impingement on our fundamental research, understanding it's not a algorithm, and we may have some disagreements about some aspects of our mission. How you think about that? This is to all three of you.
Oh.
Robert, go ahead.
Thank you. A point, Deborah, about the history. Actually, I'm reminded of the fact that Tom Ginsburg at Chicago turned up one of the founding speeches by Harper, the first president of Chicago, in which he actually advocates for institutional neutrality. So there is actually more history than than the one that goes back to Calvin. Point one. Point two, I do disagree with your equation of a platonic freedom with neutrality. The point of education is not neutral. The point of education is to educate. And we do whatever is necessary to do that. And with regard to that goal, we cannot be neutral or not pursuing the goal. I think we get very close to a tautology here when we say, well, if the university has a reason to speak out, then it's internal. Because then that leaves us with the position that if it has no reason to speak out, then it shouldn't speak out, which of course should be the case. The university should never speak gratuitously. If they speak, they should have a very good reason to speak, and then we have to think about the context of that and what that is. But if that reason, which the leader, let's hypothesize a case where the leader of the university believes it's in the ultimate interest of the university to do that, like the one that Deborah posed, protecting the library next door, then if that becomes an internal reason, then of course we've assimilated everything to the internal. We just have to be very careful of going down that slippery slope.
Okay, great. So of course I agree with the points you made, but the reason I don't think it's a good idea to leave it case by case is because it's a trap. It's a trap to fall into issuing statements because of the problem of inconsistency. Once you issue one statement, that will generate endless demands to continue to issue statements. And then you also go into the problem of why did you issue a statement about this, but not about this other issue? So I just don't think that this is a question of each specific instance. The cost-benefit analysis that I propose is for the category of issuing statements. And I still don't see any benefits. I sometimes feel like folks who oppose institutional neutrality and make the empirical critique that Robert made, and there are many areas where we agree, and I'll point that out in a second, aren't clear about whether these statements have an impact or not. Do they have an impact? Because Robert Poe said, no, they should not affect the research. Well, then why are you issuing the statement if it has no impact? I don't understand. If it does have an impact, I'm worried about chilling speech. If it doesn't have an impact, don't issue the statement. It has no impact. So I just don't understand. I don't think there's any room there for it to have an impact only of the kind that you like, but not of the kind of chilling faculty and student speech. I mean, there's lots more to say. I do agree with Robert that it's not clear that there's an obligation on universities on their academic freedom. I think that's right. It is more prudential. I agree with that piece. But I think the arguments are so compelling for universities not to get into the business of doing this. And one more point. Robert made a great point about this being an ideological attack on higher education. Notice they don't attack the University of Chicago. If it's an ideological attack, why are they not attacking the University of Chicago? I don't see it. I haven't seen a single politician come out against the University of Chicago.
Great, yeah. Thank you for this further conversation and these provocations. So, Deborah, since you're now a historian, I'm going to be a philosopher. It's only fair, right? And try to answer this question about sort of why do we do it? Because I've been thinking about this myself. Like, why would you go through the trouble, right? I'm hearing that from administrators, it takes so long. I spend all my time writing these statements. Like, why would you do it? And I think that it goes back to this question of what are the adjacent values of a truth-seeking community. And I just said hypothetically, what if we say that those values are free expression on the one hand and something like belonging, I'm going to use the term belonging, on the other. And here I'm drawing on my colleague Jeff Cohen's new book on belonging and work that he's done with another Stanford psychologist, Greg Walton, on belonging uncertainty. And they did an interesting study where they showed that if a white professor is grading the paper of an African American student and they write on that paper somewhere, I believe in you, then the student is so much more likely to read the comments that are the objective scientific comments of critique that one would expect in a community of discourse. But that small gesture, that interpersonal gesture that establishes that sort of relationality between student and teacher, the one that's so delicate, going back to Plato, so easy to abuse, right? Just that small gesture sort of clears the table and creates the trust that's required to build that sort of shared epistemic foundation, shared knowledge foundation for our community of discourse. And so I've been thinking about, well, what is the equivalent on the institutional level? Like, is there some way in which making a statement, if it comes from the position of, reassuring students that they belong as knowers, that their dignity as full knowers and learners in this community is intact, that statement could help to, again, clear the air to create that trust which is necessary for that community of practice that then would allow us to continue with this sort of business of truth-seeking. So it's sort of a philosophical kind of argument, I think. But there's also good psychological research from our colleagues who do that show that this really has an impact. It has an impact on student success. It has an impact on how one relates to the community. And I think this issue, and I'll just say one more thing and then turn it back to Deborah, is this issue also touches on something else, which sometimes is called epistemic relationality. How do individual knowers kind of relate to one another in these communities? And it's kind of a blind spot for the tradition of academic freedom and academic discourse. because of the way that academic freedom kind of gets adopted in America in the beginning of the 20th century, and sort of it adapts and iterates the German concepts of Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, the freedom to research and the freedom to learn. The Americans are really not as interested in sort of preserving freedom of learning in the American idea of academic freedom. And they sort of drop that in the 1915 AAUP statement, and they focus entirely on the freedom of teaching and the freedom of scholarship. I think that sort of blind spot sort of continues over the decades. And I think we have a relatively unsophisticated, undeveloped concept for epistemic relationality, how it is that we as individuals relate to one another in a community of discourse. And I think that is the root of a lot of the threats to academic freedom.
Great. I want to push a little bit on this idea of neutrality. I'm going to defend Plato's Academy. So no plausible view of neutrality can be neutral about everything. You know, it's sometimes said a liberal is somebody who can't take his own side in an argument. That can't be the view of liberal neutrality. So no one who endorses the university being neutral thinks the university has to be neutral towards the production of knowledge and the education of students. And that already is a pretty hefty load of values you are signing on to. And I agree with you, Emily. I think it means signing on to some values about inclusion and belonging. Because in order to create the conditions under which students learn and knowledge is produced, can't be ruled by intimidation. It can't be ruled by authority. It has to be, right, you create a community of scholars oriented around this value of truth. And that has repercussions, it has commitments, and it has implications for things outside the university, not just inside the university. But I still think, I guess, that form of neutrality, while capacious, has limits. And it does have limits on saying things on, and then there will be cases where we might disagree. Some of the issues around health might be ones where people say it's just not clear how to think about this bearing on the university. I mean, I think, Robert, you raised the Dobbs decision. The Faculty Senate is thinking about, Atlas and public health. Should the university not issue statements on that? We certainly did issue a lot of statements on masking on campus, and we made it a mandate. I don't think that violated neutrality.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think I agree with Emily and her point about the story you told about a professor telling the student, I believe in you. I think all of that is internal. We should be setting up a community that tells students and faculty that we support them. And all of that is internal, and it is not a problem. I am only talking about a narrow category of statements about external events. And I don't think any statement about foreign policy, about domestic political disputes, is equivalent to I believe in you at all. I would hope that it's not at all equivalent to that. I hope that we send those messages to students internally. I think if, for instance, there's a foreign policy disaster, Russia invades Ukraine, the role of the school is to reach out to the students individually who are affected. And those messages can say, I believe in you. It is not to send an email taking a position on that issue to the world, because that is not, I think, the same as saying, I believe in you. Have the dean of students. It is their role to reach out to these students who are affected. We do that. The University of Chicago does that. None of that challenges the narrow point that we're making about neutrality.
Any other comments, or else I'll open it up for...
Might I say a word?
Yes. Yeah.
So you can say this about diversity and inclusion, But if you actually look at the debate as it exists now on questions of diversity and inclusion, there are endless numbers of commentators who are saying it is inconsistent with institutional neutrality for a university to take a position about inclusion and diversity. Why? Because the university cannot take, and they understand the Calvin report and neutrality to be, you cannot take a position on a matter of, quote, public controversy, end quote. So the minute we start carving out of public controversy anything that's of concern to the university, then we get into the dilemma that I was talking about earlier, which is you seem to be saying we can't take any position about which we have no interest. And in which case, why would we be doing such a thing? So, I mean, just take a concrete example. Let's say Nigeria closes down all its universities, and American university presidents say, we need a world in which knowledge is free, and we condemn this action by Nigeria. Right? Is that our mission? Not our mission? How do we even conceptualize that question? It's relevant to the world in which universities exist, that knowledge is respected, that expertise is respected. Now, Diego said, do you have an impact or don't you have an impact? You have different kinds of impacts. You can have an impact on somebody's research. You can have an impact on creating a climate of opinion. There are many different dimensions and constituencies within which impacts happen. And if you are going to speak as a university administrator, you have to be careful to do it in a way that doesn't foreclose the research and statements of the members of your faculty. I mean, a simple example of this is our religious universities. There are many religious universities in the United States, and they routinely make statements about theology. And if it were true that as a matter of cost-benefit analysis, you can never make such statements, there would be no academic freedom and religious universities couldn't exist, but they do, and they flourish. So as an empirical matter, this is it's not a question of a kind of abstract consistency. It's a question of taking a sober accounting of what's actually going on in any particular controversy and what the university's relationship is to it, and being very careful to preserve the values that you hold dear.
Can I just add to that really quickly? Because you touched on something that I wanted to also get out there, which is, you mentioned religious institutions. We in America have an extremely heterogeneous sort of ecosystem of institutions that have, in addition to truth-seeking, other missions. They serve specific populations, historically Black colleges, Native Americans. We have women's colleges, right? In addition to religious institutions, if you know, a women's college in a state was in a state that outlawed abortion or something, then I think it would, you know, the president of that college would probably be on good grounds to say, well, part of our mission is, you know, promoting women's autonomy and the dignity of their bodies, and it would make sense to, you know, make a statement on that political issue because it is congruent with, you know, the mission of the institution. And I think that's why institutions that have strong, coherent cultural identities, or what's sometimes called sagas, right? They know who they are and what they stand for, do better in these moments. And I think we've certainly seen that, you know, in the last 6 months.
Just very briefly, a couple of points, and I'm really enjoying the conversation. I really think these are great points of discussion. Notice the hypothetical on Nigeria closing its universities. Hungary did have a direct attack on the Central University of Budapest. As far as I'm aware, we didn't say anything, which is even more ironic. We've had this position of taking positions, and that's a direct attack on universities, and we didn't say anything about that. So the policy as it is does not seem to be serving our values very well. Two, just very briefly on the impact, I do think the difficulty with your position, Robert, is that you're now saying it has an impact, but only of the kind you like, which is a very difficult one in an empirical question. You're saying it may have an impact, but only of the kind I like, because the university leaders doing so will take care not to affect the research. I think my claim is that it's very extremely hard and highly unlikely that we're getting that right, and that if it has an impact, it's chilling the speech of faculty, and if it doesn't have an impact, it's not worth saying. And finally, religious schools. The claim is not as strong as to say that the costs are so high that if you issue statements, it will end the university. That is not the claim. The claim is that it weakens the university's mission. It weakens the research. And yes, my prediction is that religious schools produce either less research of high quality or weaker research of high quality. And that's a testable prediction that we can actually look at. So that would be the claim, that it's weaker research because of all the position taking.
Okay, well, this is great, but I'd love to open it up to the audience. There are mics. Just line up in the mics, and we'd love to hear from you. And don't be shy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the discussion. It's very, very interesting. And this discussion made me think about what's a political issue, what's external to a university. And I guess my question would be to Professor Zambrano. Is there any extent that the social or political context of a country or for a particular state might influence your position of the role of the universities? And my thought was climate change. This has been labeled as a political thing, and if there was a social class, political climate denialists, would this mean that a university should not acknowledge that anthropogenic climate change is an existential issue, and universities should not only produce a statement but also advocate to take measures politically? So yeah, thank you.
Great question. So I think the way the university intervenes in this debate is by hiring the best researchers who are debunking the critiques of whether climate change is real or not. The university does its best when it provides a home for excellent research that convinces the public that climate change is real. I don't think the university does anything when it takes a position in an email to the entire country. It does a lot when it funds, hires, and supports faculty who are putting the research out there every week on the reality of climate change. And that's what we need to focus on. We have a climate school, right? That's an example. It does not challenge. This is not the kind of neutrality that I'm talking about. We have a lot of centers that do great work. We could argue about whether centers should or should not be able to take positions, but we have them, and they're taking positions. And the kind of institutional neutrality that I'm talking about would not change that. It would only change the opportunity for our administrators to send these emails, which again, I don't think do anything at all.
Can I do a quick follow-up? Yeah. Would it be different if in these statements, email us, they include reference to these studies and these scientific documents produced by the research centers? Because I'm thinking about any statement that's just made by an administrator on the science school. No, I am talking about having a position, a studied position that could advocate based on the university's own research.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have a media department that does a great job of saying every week, releasing a newsletter on all the excellent research that we put out. So we're doing that. We're doing that to great effect. And I think we are making a huge impact on the world. And it reminds me, I think it's related to Emily's story of, it's this parable, right, of they came for X and we didn't do anything they came. No, the university did a lot of things with the research. It was doing something the whole time. It had hired amazing faculty who were defending democracy in their research. It had hired amazing students who graduated and went to argue against the authoritarian government. The university was doing something the entire time. Just because it didn't issue an email doesn't mean it wasn't doing anything. That's what we do. We're amazing at it. We have the best universities in the world. We are the envy of the world. These are the crown jewels of this country. And our job is to safeguard them. And when we maintain the kind of neutrality that I'm talking about, we make them better so they can focus on what they're good at.
Okay, thank you.
One quick footnote on this, because I'm conscious of Robert Post being here. I mean, I learned a lot from Robert Post on the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech. You know, faculty have academic freedom, but it's not quite the same as freedom of speech because we evaluate our faculty's speech when we give tenure, and we evaluate the quality of their research. And so the university, again, isn't neutral about the quality of scholarship. We allow peers, right, to weigh in on, is this good science or is this good research?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think it does force us to nuance, Diego, your point about centers that do knowledge, whose express purpose is to solve big problems in the world. And again, not to go back to the 60s, but the emergence of centers at this time at the University of Chicago and elsewhere made them a site where this precise issue about the relationship between university and society was being contested and was being adjudicated, right? So I think it's not so easy to say we have these places that, you know, get a pass and get to do this kind of world-oriented work, but the rest of us are somehow insulated, because I think that in the messy area in campus where academic freedom and free speech, however distinct, run up against each other, that's where we have trouble. Academic freedom, as Robert Post has written, and Deborah was just alluding to, governs university speech, which is speech oriented towards research and teaching, towards truth seeking. And in the modern period anyway, let's leave Plato behind for a little bit, it's governed by the disciplines. And the discipline of, you know, ecology and the discipline of immunology, you know, and so forth have their own criteria for what constitutes evidence and what a reasonable argument is, and what perhaps the boundaries of argumentation are, and what is an argument that's outside the pale and perhaps not made in good faith. And so I think this gets at kind of both of these examples, the one that was made about climate change as well as the one that Dean Brest asked us to consider about Scott Atlas, which is that, you know, in a best case scenario, the experts should be evaluating, you know, whether or not that speech is good or bad, is true or false, right? They do that through peer review. They do that through the promotion of scholars, through the discourse in which they debate these issues. Right? But in interdisciplinary communities, which is what all American campuses are, we don't actually have a good mechanism for how we adjudicate what is truth and what is not. And I think one of the questions in the Scott Atlas case is, you know, is there any lever? Is the faculty senate? You know, can you think about the faculty senate, which was supposed to be the information and sort of deliberative wing of the university? Is that where faculty have that voice? And if not there, then where?
Great. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for the wonderful conversation. And I have a slightly provocative question, largely directed towards Professor Levine, given your analysis on the exceptions in the Calvin report. But we'd love to hear everybody's thoughts. There's been some note in the press and otherwise about the recent rise in universities in China, and both in terms of the quality of their research, but also in reputational rankings, almost breaking into the top 10 this year. I would surmise that universities in China do not operate under the environment of free expression that we would conceive of in the United States. And so my question is, do you think democracy should be a bedrock principle that the university must defend in terms of pursuing its mission, or that it might be possible to do that absent the values and traditions of Western liberalism?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and I think it gets precisely at the paradoxical relationship between the university and society, right? Because, and especially the way this plays out with speech, because I've sort of argued that university speech is governed by academic understanding of speech, and we do this over here, but of course, universities also train students to go out into the world, right? And in civil discourse, to use speech in the context of democracies, and as such, we're playing a pretty important role in promoting democracy and in the idea that free speech is a sort of cornerstone of that democracy. So I think we've ended up in a pretty messy place at the current moment. What I will say from my limited time that I've had exchanging with Chinese colleagues at, for example, in Beijing, is what's amazing to me is how they look to 19th century Germany as a model for what is possible. By which I mean they look to a model in which the boundaries between the university and society were much clearer, in which you could say what you wanted in a university, as Kant famously said, say what you will, but obey, right? This idea of cordoning off the university as this kind of cordon sanitaire for rigorous, robust, even dissenting ideas is okay in the context of a national political culture in which, otherwise subservience is kind of assumed. And I think, from what I see from colleagues there, they're sort of testing that, perhaps less after 2017, 2018, but that has been one of the sort of positions that they've been testing in this area.
I would just say that I think the production of knowledge is a complex formula. And I think one important ingredient is to have as free an exchange of ideas as possible. But if you increase the other ingredients to the max, if you give researchers endless amounts of money, you will have worse research relative to what you could have if you had freedom of speech and democracy, but you may still produce some excellent research. So it's a complex formula. Freedom of speech and democracy are ingredients, but they're not the only ingredients. And so yes, you could still have, the Soviet Union had great rocketry research, right? So it's definitely possible. I just think it's worse than what you could have.
But so buried as an assumption in what you just said, though, is the idea that in the production of knowledge, more speech is always better. And I want to push back against that, because I think this goes back to this nuance point that Deborah mentioned, which is that in the production of knowledge, more speech is not always better. Good speech is better. Reasoned speech is better. Disciplined speech is better. Evidence is better, right? And so that's why we have these disciplinary frameworks for determining and discerning and judging and so forth. So I actually think it's really important to keep those distinct, despite the messiness that I was kind of conceding in our current moment and perhaps much of the modern period, because I do think that these frameworks have their own times and places.
Part of the issue here is universities have twin missions, education and research. So the first question I would ask about Chinese universities is, what do we mean by education? If we mean technological competence, of course that's possible with restrictions, but that isn't what we would mean in the United States by education. That isn't what Deborah meant when she said the freedom to become an adult who thinks for oneself. I don't think it's possible to have that kind of research with extrinsic limitations about what you can and can't think. So let's put aside the educational function of universities. Let's now talk about the research function and ask, what is the difference between a research facility like, say, Xerox PARC or any of the biotech firms that are in the South Bay and a university? These are different. And one of the differences between the production of knowledge, technological knowledge, and a university is that a university provides and educates the criteria by which we recognize something as true or not true. It produces the disciplinary standards by which we measure whether Xerox PARC has actually discovered something, because then it has to be assimilated into the teaching criteria and into the way in which physics understands itself or whatever. Universities are unique institutions to do that. That's the only institution in a society that does that. And if the university cannot freely do that, then it can't perform the same function that we want a university to perform as we do in the United States. We have a different kind of thing. We have a state-supported research institution like the Xerox PARC, which is a different thing altogether.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Next.
Hello. I was hoping to ask a question on more about value trade-offs and values, as well as the mission of the university, which I think has sort of been discussed as truth-seeking, or at least a part of it is truth-seeking and knowledge. And I think as it relates to this issue, the idea about like that the university is independent, and like the values of the institution, but also the values of those who comprise the institution as it relates to the faculty or the administration, in that maybe those values aren't necessarily like representative of broader society when it comes to level of education or honestly politically. So I guess like how would you all frame this kind of I guess like imbalance between everyone who comprises Stanford essentially like that juxtaposition as it relates to this issue of institutional neutrality, if that makes sense.
Great question.
What you see now is that the political parties are divided by educational attainment more than by anything else. I think that's probably the first time in U.S. history that's true. And if that's the case, then universities, by what we do, are inserting ourselves into a partisan situation by our very mission, by our mission of education. And that puts us in an extremely vulnerable position. And that means that in the kind of cost-benefit analysis that Diego's put on the table, you have to be really careful where you're going to go outside your lane and go outside your mission, because it's going to become a partisan issue, and nothing is deadlier in the United States than making it a partisan issue. So I read that as saying, well, that puts us in a pincers movement, and therefore the need for the kind of careful calibration is all the finer and all the more important that we be very careful.
I mean, this goes back also to what I was saying before about values. I mean, values can obviously be mapped onto political discourse. And when Dean Brest and I were organizing our conference, I remember, we were saying we're doing a conference on civil discourse, and our colleagues on the right said, well, that's just a cover for politeness, and our colleagues on the left said, well, that's just a cover for I don't know, complicit in a racist system or something, right? I mean, just sort of and so even just the value itself is challenged as somehow partisan by both sides, right? So this is a real uphill battle. I mean, I empathize, but we can't abandon the value because it's politically divisive when we believe it's so central. I think what we need to do is, it behooves us to make our institutions look a little bit more like the rest of the country. We need to do more like what Tom Schnabelt is doing over at Hoover Institution with his project to try to bring more, students from rural communities in this country to this institution, right? To have true heterogeneity and intellectual diversity in order to actually begin to address this issue, this wider issue, in which our values are politically partisan.
Yeah, I would also just add, two things: the value of humility when
Yes.
we ourselves are in some way in a bubble, that we have to be careful to be aware of that. And so humility, but also outreach. It's really important, especially in our social science research, that we're working with people from who are different than we are and have different perspectives. Are we going to put up the poll? Do I have more people on the
I think
line?
there's a couple more people.
Okay, so let's take a few more on the line, but maybe people could also vote. I know it's...
My question is primarily for Diego, but whoever as well. In the way that you picture institutions taking a position, for you it's been sending out an email to the whole world. You've said that a couple of times. But that's a very explicit way of taking a position. I think the institution implicitly takes a lot of positions. A good example has been, for example, investing in apartheid South Africa. Or, if you had money in Russia in 2012 versus now, that's a very different time. Do you choose to keep that money invested or not? In those settings, the institution is almost forced into taking a position publicly. How do you suggest institutions approach those situations, those challenges?
I mean, I would start by saying, if we're now talking about that kind of position taking, we've moved to a great territory. we've made a lot of progress because over the last 10 years, schools have been doing a lot of the external, explicit position taking. So if we've now agreed that that might be a problem, let's now focus on other kinds, great. Okay, let's start talking about that. I think it's inevitable. Part of it is that the university truly is a community, right? So just by the very fact that we have high standards of tenure, or by the very fact that we have a pipeline where it's ideological, right? By the very nature of the country right now, more left-wing folks go into higher education than right-wing. That's going to affect the university's positions. I mean, we're going to have, 50 events that implicitly and explicitly take the Ukrainian position in the invasion of the war. I don't think there's much to do about that. I don't think the university, it would actually challenge academic freedom for the university to try to do something about that. Each faculty member and groups of students have the freedom to organize whatever the events they want. So there, I don't think there is much to do other than maximize intellectual diversity to the extent that you're still complying with your rigorous recruitment of faculty and students, rigorous tenure process, which is the bedrock of the university. But there are some examples where maybe, the university should avoid taking an implicit position. For instance, in the way it maintains websites. It's not sending out an email, but maybe it maintains websites that signal to one ideology or another. It should avoid doing that. I would agree. And so I think we would have to talk about example by example there. I do think case by case there, rather than a kind of flat rule.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. My question is to Professor Levine. Why do we need the university as a corporation to make a statement? We have individual faculty members who are very smart people, and they have the freedom to speak as individuals, and they can write, as people have been doing, open letters collectively or as individuals. So why do we need the alternative that the university speaks on behalf of everyone?
I'm not sure that we do. I mean, I think that the question as it was phrased was, should university officials, I think, well, we debated this actually. Should they be authorized to? Should they be permitted to? Or should they? Right? And I think, those are all different questions. I think it would be my preference if the kind of sort of activation of what I'm calling like the educational imperative comes endogenously from the university, that it comes from the faculty, right? That it comes in the form of a faculty letter offering support. For example, as happened at Vanderbilt a few weeks ago, the faculty wrote a letter of support to Jewish students after a discriminatory kind of campaign was started by their classmates, right? And at the end of the letter, they said this is done in the interest of civility. People sign and don't sign letters for all sorts of reasons. We expect everyone to treat people civilly, and we want also, based on these histories and these reasons, to show the support. That to me is actually the most authentic version of this kind of gesture of inclusion that I've actually seen, because nobody was forced to do it. It didn't come from the top down. It came from the inside, and I think it has the impact of the good impact of making everybody feel like they belong and re-articulating, re-identifying what those values are. And in their document, they referred to their university's kind of equivalent of their fundamental standard, which is called the Vanderbilt Creed, and they say, here we treat each other with mutual respect, and so forth and so on. And so, that to me is a great example of how it goes well. I'm not like carrying the banner for universities to get out there and do there, but I oppose the idea that we would force upon universities an adherence to neutrality, which is orthodox, and I think has the opposite effect, which has, since 2022, silenced not just administrators, but everybody, including faculty who think that they can't intervene, they can't tip the scale, which is a gross misunderstanding of their educational responsibility.
I could just add to that a little bit. Um, there's different images of the university. You could think of it as a collection of autonomous faculty, autonomous students. It's kind of like a marketplace, and students are consumers and they buy what they want from whatever course they want, and faculty go from institution to institution depending on who's paying them better, give them better lab, something like that. That's actually not the way university works. Universities, if they're working well, are communities. They are integrated. And universities, if they work well, only work well because there's a lot of trust between students and faculty, among faculty. This is a precious commodity. And often when you're leading an institution that requires trust, you have to speak in ways that affirm that trust and that speak to the needs of the people in the community, which might not be immediately cashed out in terms of either education, narrowly conceived, or research, narrowly conceived. The work of community maintenance is a huge, difficult task. And often it leads to the kind of inconsistencies that Diego's pointed out. I mean, when I was dean, there could be an earthquake in Tibet and you don't say something, but there's a tidal wave in Malaysia and you do, and why did you and why didn't you? And that's a terror of any thoughtful administrator. It doesn't follow from that potential inconsistency that when the work of community maintenance is really necessary, you don't engage in it. And that may require statements on behalf of the institution that give support to members of the institution that require it at a given time, understanding the downsides that exactly Diego puts on the table, and then making a cost benefit out, whether it happens to be worth it. But I just want to put on the table for you to understand that this idea of community maintenance is itself a deep university interest. It's an interest of every unit within the university, and it often requires doing things that you can't narrowly put into a box.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, which is the last question, so it all works out.
Great. Thank you all for coming in and speaking with us today. It seems like that all three of you are in agreement that there are some things that we should be neutral about and other things that we shouldn't be. I was wondering if you guys could spell out in concrete terms how each of your definitions differ. What exactly do you think a university should be neutral about and shouldn't be neutral about? If we take a concrete example like Israel-Gaza, should Stanford have issued statements after October 7th in the form of an email? Was that an appropriate response according to each of your paradigms?
Right, so I think foreign policy is one of the easiest answers. We should definitely not say anything about that. We shouldn't say anything about Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza, anything about foreign affairs. That's easy to me. It gets harder when I do think if it affects the interests of the university. And if there's a debate in Congress about an omnibus bill that includes increasing taxes on endowments, I think the university can talk about that. It affects it. A hard one for affirmative action, that affects how we operate, right? That one's hard. The travel ban, we recruited a lot of scholars. So those are hard, but I think if we've moved into that, great. We're making lots of progress. Now let's have those hard conversations and weigh what the benefits and costs might be. But generally speaking, these statements should almost never happen if you followed my argument. The University of Chicago has issued statements. It has over the last 20 years. And so it doesn't mean it never happens. It's just rarer. And hopefully that saves the kind of persuasive power of the university for when it actually does matter to the core interests of the university.
Yeah, we almost got to the end. I think, one thing about the exception clause, the Nazi exception clause, is that it's very easy from 1967 to say what they should have done in 1933, right? And that's kind of how history works. With hindsight, we can turn around and say, wow, that was one of them extraordinary events. We should have been in there doing something about it, right? Look at how many lives were lost. Look at the values. We really misread that situation, right? And I think we're still so close to October 7th and the Hamas-Israel war. It's going to be a while before we're able to unpack that. I do think that there were missed opportunities that could have happened that would have been congruent with the kinds of missions and values that we're talking about. Certainly presidents of other institutions that made strong statements on October 10th, of response to, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, kind of had that done. They said it. And they also said, we're also going to, in the coming days, preserve speech on campus. And please know that, lots of blood is going to be shed, and there will be anti-Israel rallies. I mean, you didn't have to have a huge crystal ball to see what was going to happen, right? So presidents who did that, I think, kind of laid the groundwork for, I think, calmer situations on campus. But that was an event which very quickly started on the other side of the world, and within 24 hours was turning our campus upside down. And I think given that the expressions also of anti-Semitism came sort of in the relishing of that massacre and the relishing of death, which I think was what was so disturbing well before kind of the Israeli ground invasion, I think that there was cause to speak up about, the values that we expect to see on this campus, even understanding that people will have different political positions on an issue as complex as the Middle East, and that we expect our students to kind of abide those values of mutual respect as we work through this hard time. So, that's the kind of thing that one might have done, but, that with hindsight, and of course it's just in the moment, it's hard to know what exactly is playing out and how it will impact the community.
I'll give you an autobiographical example. I was dean of a law school, so it's a small law school. It's like Stanford Law School, about that size. So it really is a community, not like, you speak almost metaphorically of a community the size of Stanford or Yale University, but this was a law school, and it was Ferguson, Missouri, you might remember, where an African-American was shot down cold in the streets. And my students were hurting. They were deeply hurting. We had to hold school-wide meetings to talk about it. And they felt extremely vulnerable and unprotected, the African-American students at Yale, the Black students. And I felt like I'm going to make a statement about law enforcement and the need to make sure that law enforcement abides by due process. Now, you could say that relates to the mission of a law school, but it's tenuous. I strove my best to make it part of the mission of a law school, but in point of fact, I was doing it to maintain the trust and identification and the sense of community within the school. And I did make a statement about that. I made it along with Martha Minow, who was dean of Harvard Law School at the time. And I did it for precisely the reasons that I mentioned earlier about what it means to maintain a school that trusts each other.
And I should say, I do think community maintenance is an important value. And I'm sure Robert can tell us about all the different ways he did that. But my guess is issuing that statement was not really most of what you did. What you did is you organize town meetings. You go and show up to specific affinity groups. You talk to them one-on-one. You invite them to come to your office. You invite faculty to have open office hours for anyone who's not feeling well. That's how I think you do it. I don't think this particular way of doing it does much community building, though I understand the motivation to do it that way. And I'll say on Israel-Palestine, one of the problems is inconsistency. Yeah. And clearly the problem they were facing is universities have been issuing statements endlessly for 10 years. And you can't just not issue out of all of a sudden. You need to do a good job preparing everyone.
Right.
So you have to lay the groundwork for it so that you're not accused of this inconsistency. Absolutely. University of Chicago could easily, I'm sorry I've mentioned it too many times, they could easily not issue a statement and it was not a sign of anything. Now, if other schools couldn't do that.
So please join me in thanking our speakers for a great conversation. And thanks to all of you. And next week we'll be debating guns and gun control. What?
The poll should be available,
The poll was up. There was a lot of mind change Can we put the poll back up? The number of people, yeah, so the support for issuing statements went down substantially between the beginning and the end. Anyway, changing minds, as Paul said, not the goal. It's understanding and really appreciating the complexity of the issues and seeing why people disagree. So thank you again for being here, and thanks to our speakers.